Israel's government is considering deporting Eritrean asylum seekers who were involved in violent protests on Saturday. Around 160 people were injured in clashes with police and infighting between rival groups supporting and opposing the Eritrean government. They broke through police barriers and attacked cars and businesses nearby. Israeli police used live gunfire, tear gas and stun grenades to try to push them back. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that chaotic scenes in Tel Aviv had crossed a red line.
The massive illegal infiltration into Israel from Africa posed a real threat to Israel's future as a Jewish and democratic state. We stopped this threat by building the fence. There remains the problem of those who had already entered before the completion of the fence. These are tens of thousands of illegal infiltrators who entered Israel.
Our Middle East correspondent Yolande Knell told me more about how the protests unfolded.
Well, just a day ago, there were these really riotous scenes in the south of Tel Aviv. What happened is that the Eritrean embassy in Israel was planning to hold an event at a hall there, and there had already been warnings from Eritrean activists that that should not be allowed to go ahead. They'd asked the Israeli authorities to block it and said there was a risk of violence. We very much saw that. Large crowds of Eritrean asylum seekers opposed to the government in their native country broke through police barricades, and we had these very violent scenes. The police looked like they had been caught somewhat off guard by the scale of the crowds that were there, and they used live gunfire, these stun grenades, tear gas, all different measures to try to push back the protesters. But then what we also saw, they were trying to divide groups of protesters from each other, because within the Eritrean community there is this deep division between those who are for and against the government back in Eritrea. And they were wearing opposing colours, red and blue, and were fighting each other on the streets with rocks, with large pieces of metal in some cases, and there was lots of vandalism. Shops were smashed up, cars were smashed. The police were on horseback as well, trying to push people off the streets, and it was several hours before they managed to bring the situation under control. So something that was really quite unprecedented. So not surprisingly, today we have been seeing a big political fallout of that, with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu calling a special ministerial meeting to discuss what should happen next.
And looking at what could happen next, of course, Israel's hardline government considering tough measures, including the deportation of Eritrean asylum seekers. Could there be further clashes, or does that hardline approach seem to have worked? Has these clashes de-escalated? Has tensions de-escalated?
I mean, the tensions in Tel Aviv are still simmering away within the community, but I think they've also been replaced somewhat by feelings of great uncertainty because of the very strong message that has come out from the Israeli government. You know, with Israel so split at the moment on this issue of the government's very highly controversial plans to pass through a judicial overhaul, some other items on the political agenda have sort of been put aside, including this one about migration and those people whom Mr. Netanyahu refers to as illegal infiltrators. They're people who crossed into Israel from Egypt through the Sinai Desert in the main several years ago. There's now a big border fence that prevents large numbers of people from crossing in the same way. And really, there are members of the far right, the cabinet ministers, who have long wanted to tackle this issue of about 30,000 sub-Saharan Africans who remain in Israel. About 20,000 of them come from Eritrea. The figures aren't exactly clear. Now, Mr. Netanyahu is saying he wants to see the immediate deportation of those who were involved in the latest violence, and there are about 40 people that we already knew of that are being kept now in administrative detention, who were rounded up by the police a day ago, mainly for public disorder offences. But he's asked ministers who at his meeting earlier as well if they can come up with other plans to deport people en masse. And that is something that will be very worrying for asylum seekers and migrants here in Israel.
Yolande Knell speaking to me a little earlier on.